Tunis, April 14th, 1988. The clock in the hallway read 6:23 a.m. when the housekeeping cart rolled quietly across the fourth-floor carpet. Its wheels made a soft, familiar sound, one that blended into the morning routine of the Hotel Africa. The woman pushing had followed this same path for years, stopping at each door, knocking twice, waiting, then unlocking and entering rooms that blurred together in memory. For 7 years, nothing unusual had ever happened. That morning would be different, though she had no way of knowing it yet. Her name was Fatima Ben Ali. She was 43, a widow, and the mother of 2 daughters. She had worked at the hotel since it opened in 1981, valued by management for being punctual, quiet, and forgettable. Those qualities made her dependable. They also made her invisible. Every morning she arrived before sunrise, collected fresh linens from the basement, and began her shift at precisely 6:15. She never asked questions. She never drew attention. 3 years earlier, a man had spoken to her outside the hotel after work. He claimed to represent a European security consultancy studying safety practices at luxury hotels across North Africa. He said employees were sometimes compensated for sharing routine observations. The money he offered equaled nearly a month's wages. Fatima hesitated, then agreed. The question seemed harmless. Which rooms were occupied long-term? Who had access to master keys? How often did security patrol the floors? She answered carefully, meeting different contacts at irregular intervals, never in the same place twice. She never asked what the information was for. No one explained. What she didn't know was that her small details were being assembled into something much larger. In offices thousands of kilometers away, analysts compared her reports with others, building a precise picture of the hotel's rhythms. To them, the Hotel Africa was more than a luxury destination. It was a hub. Since the early 1980s, senior figures from the Palestine Liberation Organization had used it regularly, including men whose movements were closely watched by Israeli intelligence. In recent weeks, the requests Fatima received became narrower. One suite on the 4th floor, its layout, the habits of its occupant, the times lights went out, the presence of guards. She noticed these questions felt different, but she continued answering them. She needed the money, and nothing bad had ever happened before on the morning of April 14th. Fatima opened her locker and found a plain envelope waiting inside. There was no note of explanation, only instructions and a key. Room 412 was to be added to her schedule. She was to enter at exactly 6:45, stay for 7 minutes, and leave the door slightly open when she left. The key was not her master key. It felt heavier, unfamiliar. Still, she placed it in her pocket without protest. She did not know that the lock on room 412 had been replaced months earlier by technicians using false credentials. She did not know the key had been cut far from Tunisia. She did not know that her actions would trigger an operation planned for over a year. The man staying in room 412 had checked in under the name Mahmoud Abbas, a deliberately common name backed by a forged Jordanian passport. His real name was Khalil al-Wazir, known throughout the Palestinian movement as Abu Jihad. He was second only to Yasser Arafat and responsible for coordinating armed operations against Israel. For decades, he had evaded capture. He believed his hotel was safe. He was wrong. By the time Fatima pushed her cart toward room 412, men were already approaching the Tunisian coast under cover of darkness. Boats cut silently through the Mediterranean. Vehicles waited inland. Routes had been memorized. Timings rehearsed. Everything depended on a door being open AT 643. Fatima stopped outside the room. She knocked twice. There was no answer. She inserted the key, turned it, and heard the lock give way. The sound echoed more loudly than it should have. She paused, then pushed the door open, stepping into a moment that would alter history without her ever fully understanding how. Fatima stepped inside room 412, expecting the quiet emptiness of a checkout suite. Instead, she froze. The room was dim, curtains drawn tight against morning sun, and a man lay asleep on the bed. His breathing was slow and deep, the steady rhythm of exhaustion rather than comfort. A digital clock on the nightstand glowed pale green. 6:45. For a moment, Instinct overpowered instruction. She should apologize, back out, close the door, pretend this mistake never happened. Every rule she had followed for years demanded it. But the instructions echoed louder than her instincts. Enter at 6:45. Stay 7 minutes. Leave the door ajar. Her heart began to pound. She told herself there must be a reason. There was always a reason, even if she was never told what it was. Slowly, deliberately, she pushed her car inside and closed the door most of the way behind her. The man did not stir. On a desk near the window, papers were spread in careful disorder, marked with handwritten notes and numbers. A telephone rested beside them. Everything about the room suggested importance, though Fatima could not have explained why. She moved as she always did, performing the motions of her work to create the sounds that housekeeping supervisors expected. She turned on the bathroom tap briefly, flushed the toilet, folded towels that were already neat. Her hands trembled, but she forced them to obey routine. Time stretched painfully. Each second felt loud. What she did not know was that the telephone line had been tapped weeks earlier. Technicians posing as maintenance workers had installed equipment invisible to guests and staff alike. The same technicians had replaced the door lock during a period when the room was vacant, fitting it with a mechanism that accepted keys never logged by hotel management. Room 412 had been prepared long before its occupant arrived. The man sleeping on the bed was not careless. Khalil al-Wazir lived with constant awareness of danger. He rose early, prayed, reviewed reports, and spent his days coordinating operations across Gaza, the West Bank, and Lebanon. His security detail rotated shifts outside his door, while hotel guards patrolled the corridors on predictable schedules. Those schedules had been reported in detail by people like Fatima, translated into diagrams and timelines by analysts who understood how to exploit predictability. The night before, al-Wazir had worked past midnight. He had spoken by phone with Arafat, discussed upcoming actions, and reviewed plans that would soon be set in motion. Exhaustion had claimed him only hours before Fatima entered the room. He had no way of knowing that the very door meant to protect him had already been compromised outside the hotel. Vehicles sat dark and silent along side streets, engines cold, drivers waiting. Inside them were men who had traveled more than 1,600 kilometers for this moment. They were dressed like civilians, their weapons concealed in bags that looked unremarkable. They watched their watches, listening for a signal that would never come in words, AT-651. Fatima's 7 minutes were nearly complete. She had followed every instruction. She walked toward the door, her legs heavy, her thoughts racing. She pulled it closed most of the way, leaving a narrow opening, just as she had been told. The corridor beyond was empty, bathed in fluorescent light. Then movement point 3 men emerged from the elevator at the far end of the hall. They did not walk like guests. Their steps were measured, synchronized. Their eyes scanned everything. One of them looked directly at Fatima. Their gaze met for a fraction of a second. He gave a brief nod, almost imperceptible. That was enough. Fatima turned and pushed her cart toward the service elevator. She did not run. She did not look back. She kept her pace steady, ordinary, the way she had learned over years of invisibility. Behind her, the door to room 412 opened fully as the service elevator doors slid shut. Sounds reached her ears that did not belong in a hotel at dawn. A sharp shout, furniture crashing, then a final, flat crack that cut through everything else. The elevator descended, carrying Fatima away, while history was being rewritten one floor above her. The assault inside room 412 was over almost as soon as it began. The men who entered moved with rehearsed precision, each step aligned with months of planning. Abu Jihad woke to the sound of strangers in his room, his instinct sharpened by decades of survival. He reached for the pistol kept beside his bed, firing a single shot before the weight of trained force overwhelmed him. Within seconds, the struggle ended. The room fell silent again, as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. The gunfire was muted, designed to sound like chaos rather than combat. In the corridor, the 2 bodyguards assigned to the room reacted too late. Another team emerged from the stairwell, trapping them between angles they had never anticipated. The exchange lasted moments. By the time either man could call for help, it was already over. The fourth floor returned to an uneasy calm. Inside the room, the team worked quickly. One group secured the space while others moved the desk, photographing documents, collecting folders, and scanning pages for names and numbers that analysts would later dissect. Nothing was left to chance. Every movement followed a mental checklist, memorized long before the team ever left Israel. 90 seconds after entry, the primary objective was complete. At 6:57 a.m., they began to withdraw. They exited in small groups, blending back into the hotel's early morning rhythms. Guests were beginning to stir, some heading toward breakfast, others stepping out for fresh air. No one screamed. No alarm sounded. The door to room 412 was deliberately left open. It was meant to be found quickly, before confusion could create alternate explanations. The message was part of the operation. On the third floor, Fatima continued cleaning rooms. Her hands moved automatically, folding sheets, wiping mirrors, emptying bins. Her mind was far away. She heard Ray's voices echoing from above, then running footsteps. Radios crackled. Hotel security rushed past her without a word. She kept her eyes down, just another worker doing her job 730. The hotel was in chaos. Guests were evacuated into the street as Tunisian police sealed off the area. Officers questioned staff members one by one, asking if anyone had noticed strangers, unfamiliar faces, unusual behavior. When they reached Fatima, she answered calmly. She had been cleaning the third floor all morning. She had heard noise. She did not know what it was. Her answers matched expectations perfectly. No one looked twice at her. Meanwhile, the men who had entered room 412 were already gone. Their vehicles moved through residential streets, avoiding main roads where checkpoint would soon appear. The route had been practiced repeatedly, every turn memorized. When police began blocking major exits in the city, the team was already beyond them, driving through agricultural land toward the coast. Tunisian security forces searched for intruders who no longer existed. At 741. The vehicles reached the beach. Rubber boats were launched immediately, engines low, movements efficient. Within minutes, the men were cutting across open water toward the larger vessels waiting offshore. By the time the sun rose higher over the Mediterranean, the team was already disappearing into the horizon. Back at the hotel, the identity of the man in room 412 spread quickly. Abu Jihad's death sent shockwaves through the Palestinian movement. Within hours, news reached Beirut, Gaza, and the West Bank. Demonstrations erupted. Accusations flew. How had Israeli commandos reached him in the heart of Tunis? Who had failed? Suspicions turned inward. Some blamed Tunisian security. Others whispered about betrayal within the PLO itself. No one considered the cleaning staff. A hotel made with a key did not fit the image of espionage. Fatima went home that evening exhausted. She washed her hands again and again, as if scrubbing away something she could not see. The contacts who had guided her for 3 years never reached out again. No explanations came. No warnings. No reassurance. In the days that followed, she watched the news in silence. Analysts spoke of military brilliance, intelligence failures, and political consequences. No one spoke her name. No one ever would. She returned to work as usual. Room 412 was sealed, then renovated, then reopened. New guests slept where history had unfolded. Fatima cleaned the room many times afterward. Each visit quiet, each memory unspoken. She had opened a door, believing it was routine. She would spend the rest of her life understanding that some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed. The aftermath unfolded faster than anyone inside the hotel could process. Within hours of the assassination, Tunisian authorities were facing international humiliation. A senior Palestinian leader had been killed in their capital, under their protection, without a single attacker being captured. Roadblocks appeared across the city, but they guarded emptiness. The men responsible were already far beyond Tunis. Their presence reduced the questions no one could yet answer. I end Tel Aviv. Confirmation arrived shortly after midday. The operation was declared complete. Months of planning, rehearsals, and intelligence gathering had produced the intended result. There were no celebrations, no public acknowledgement, only quiet briefings and immediate debriefings. Each participant recounted their role, their observations, the smallest details that might matter later. Intelligence collected from the room was cataloged and rushed to analysts who would spend weeks dissecting its implications. For Palestinian leadership, Abu Jihad's death was both a blow and a catalyst. He had been more than a commander. He was a strategist who translated ideology into action, the organizer who maintained discipline across scattered factions. His absence left a vacuum that no single figure could fill. Younger, more radical voices grew louder, arguing that restraint had failed and escalation was the only answer in the occupied territories. The First Intifada intensified. Demonstrations became more frequent. Clashes grew more violent. Abu Jihad was transformed into a martyr. His image carried through streets and camps. His name invoked as proof that compromise was impossible. The assassination achieved its immediate objective, but also accelerated forces that could not be easily controlled. Tunisia responded with anger. Israeli diplomats were expelled. Official protests were filed at the United Nations. The Security Council passed a resolution condemning the attack as a violation of sovereignty. Israel dismissed the condemnation as symbolic, insisting that its security needs outweighed diplomatic rebukes. The cycle repeated itself, familiar and unresolved. Inside the Hotel Africa, life slowly returned to routine. Guests checked out. New guests arrived. Staff scrubbed floors, replaced furniture, and followed instructions not to speak to press. Management emphasized professionalism, order, silence. Room 412 was renovated and reassigned. The walls absorbed fresh paint. The bed was replaced. History was disguised as normalcy. Fatima continued working. She spoke when spoken to and remained invisible when she could. Investigators never returned. The contacts who had once paid her disappeared completely. No explanation arrived. No final meeting. No warning to remain silent. The money stopped. The instructions ended. It was as if the previous 3 years had never existed. Yet the weight of them followed her everywhere. She replayed the morning endlessly in her mind. The knock, the key, the man asleep in the bed, the brief nod from the stranger in the corridor. She wondered what would have happened if she had refused, if she had closed the door and walked away. The questions had no answers, only echoes. She had not fired a weapon. She had not planned an operation. Still, she could not escape the feeling that something irreversible had passed through her hands. Years went by. Conflict shifted. New names replaced old ones in the news. But Abu Jihad's assassination remained a reference point, a lesson studied by intelligence agencies and militant groups alike. It demonstrated how ordinary environments could be turned into vulnerabilities, how the most unremarkable individuals could become decisive without ever realizing it. Fatima retired in 2003. Her co-workers celebrated her quiet dedication. They gifted her flowers and thanked her for decades of service. No one suspected that she carried a secret heavier than any compliment. She returned home that day and placed her uniform in a drawer, never to wear it again. She died years later without telling her daughters what she had done. They knew her as a hard-working woman who had lived a modest life. They never learned that she had once opened a door that altered political movements, hardened conflicts, and reshaped strategies across a region. History recorded the operation in terms of commandos, intelligence failures, and political consequences. It did not record the Maid, the key, or the 7 minutes that made everything possible. Yet without those minutes, the operation would have failed. Some events are decided not by speeches or battles, but by ordinary people performing ordinary tasks without knowing who truly benefits. Fatima Ben Ali never sought power, influence, or recognition. She simply followed instructions. And in doing so, she became part of history, without ever choosing to be. Long after the operation faded from headlines, its consequences continued to unfold in quieter, less visible ways. Within Palestinian ranks, suspicion hardened into habit. Meetings became smaller. Trust narrowed. Every failure sparked whispers of infiltration. Abu Jihad's death convinced many that no place was truly safe, not a hotel, not a friendly capital, not even exile. Security tightened, but paranoia tightened faster. Israeli intelligence drew different lessons. The operation became a case study in patience and precision. Analysts emphasize how years of minor observations, gathered by ordinary sources, could shape decisive outcomes. No single report had revealed the full picture. It was the accumulation that mattered. A schedule here, a habit there, a door prepared months in advance. The lesson was institutionalized, refined, and applied elsewhere. For Fatima, life returned to a surface-level normality that felt increasingly artificial. She woke before dawn, prepared tea, and walked familiar streets to familiar work. Guests changed, managers rotated, but the corridors remained the same. Each morning, as she pushed her cart forward, she felt the echo of that April day trailing behind her. Nothing outward marked her difference. Everything inward did. She avoided the fourth floor when she could, though eventually routine demanded she return. The first time she cleaned room 412 after it reopened, she worked with mechanical focus. The bed was different, the desk replaced, the lock new, yet the air felt heavy, as if memory itself lingered in the walls. She finished quickly and left without looking back. Years passed. The Intifada evolved. Peace talks rose and collapsed. New factions emerged, some more extreme than those Abu Jihad had once restrained. His absence was felt not only in operations, but in ideology, where he had emphasized coordination and control. Others favored spectacle and escalation. Violence became less centralized, harder to predict, more chaotic. The region shifted, inch by inch, away from any clear resolution. Now, Fatima's payments never resumed. She sometimes wondered whether the people who recruited her were still alive, whether they remembered her at all. Perhaps to them, she was simply a line in a file marked closed. The thought brought no comfort. Being forgotten did not erase responsibility. It only isolated it. She considered speaking once years later when a journalist wrote a long investigation into the assassination. The article speculated wildly about how the Israelis had gained access, corrupt officials, electronic surveillance, insider betrayal at the highest levels. Fatima read every word with shaking hands. Her truth would have shattered the story, but she said nothing. Speaking would not undo what happened. It would only destroy her family. Silence became her shield. As age slowed her movements, memories grew sharper. The sound of the lock clicking open returned to her in dreams. She would wake before dawn, heart racing, convinced she was back in the corridor. In those moments, she understood something she never had before. Intelligence operations did not only destroy their targets, they reshaped everyone they touched. When she retired, the hotel held a modest farewell. A supervisor thanked her for loyalty and consistency. Fatima smiled and nodded. Those words, loyalty and consistency, followed her home and stayed with her. She wondered how easily such virtues could be repurposed by people who understood human nature better than she ever had. In her final years, she spent time with her grandchildren, watching them play, listening to their laughter. They asked about her work sometimes. She told them she cleaned rooms, that hotels were busy places, that people came and went. She never mentioned doors or keys. History remembers operations through dates, names, and outcomes. It rarely remembers the invisible hands that made them possible. Fatima Ben Ali was one such hand. Not a hero, not a villain, just a woman whose ordinary life intersected with extraordinary forces. And that intersection, brief and unnoticed, proved enough to change everything. In the years that followed, the assassination settled into textbooks, briefings, and documentaries as a finished event, something with a clear beginning and end. But for those connected to it, directly or indirectly, there was no clean conclusion. The consequences stretched forward, reshaping choices and attitudes long after the gunfire faded. Within Israeli planning circles, the operation reinforced a belief that distance offered no protection. Geography, borders, and diplomacy were obstacles to be managed, not limits to be respected. Success in Tunis emboldened similar thinking elsewhere. If patience and preparation could reach a man guarded by a foreign state, then no adversary was untouchable. That belief became part of doctrine, repeated quietly in classrooms and strategy rooms. Among Palestinians, Abu Jihad's absence left more than an organizational gap. It removed a moderating force. He had balanced militancy with structure, believing discipline was essential for survival. After his death, authority fragmented. Leaders competed for influence. Smaller groups acted independently, often without coordination. The struggle became louder, bloodier, and less predictable. What had once been a centralized resistance began to splinter into parallel currents, each convinced it held the true path forward. Fatima watched these changes from the margins of daily life. She followed the news without comment, absorbing stories that felt uncomfortably personal. Each headline reminded her that history was not abstract. It was built from decisions, some grand, some seemingly insignificant. She wondered how many other people like her existed, carrying pieces of events they would never fully understand. She never returned to the locker where she had found the envelope. It had been replaced, repainted, reassigned. Still, the memory of that moment remained vivid. The casual placement of the key, the simplicity of the instructions. She realized, slowly, that simplicity had been deliberate. Complicated instructions invited hesitation. Simple ones invited obedience. As she aged, her sense of guilt shifted. It no longer burned sharply. Instead, it settled into a quiet heaviness. She did not excuse herself, but she no longer condemned herself either. She accepted that she had been both used and willing. That truth resisted easy judgment. In the wider world, the assassination was often framed as inevitable. Commentators argued that someone like Abu Jihad was destined to be targeted. They debated tactics and legality, effectiveness and blowback. Rarely did they discuss the human machinery beneath the operation, the layers of ordinary labor that made extraordinary violence possible. Fatima became increasingly aware of how often systems depended on people who were never meant to see the whole picture. Cleaners, drivers, clerks, technicians, people trusted precisely because they were overlooked. She recognized herself in that pattern and understood that invisibility could be engineered as carefully as any weapon. Toward the end of her life, she wrote nothing down. She left no confession, no explanation, not because she felt nothing, but because words felt inadequate. How could she explain 7 minutes that connected her to forces far beyond her control? How could she describe a choice she never consciously made? When she died, the world did not notice. There were no headlines, no footnotes added to history. Her passing was marked only by family, by prayers spoken quietly, by memories of kindness and endurance. The secret remained intact, sealed by time. The operation in Tunis would continue to be analyzed for decades. Scholars would debate its consequences. Strategists would cite it as proof of concept. Activists would condemn it as a turning point toward greater violence. All of them would be partly right. Yet none of them would mention the woman who opened the door. History often appears to move through decisive acts carried out by powerful figures. But beneath those acts are countless smaller movements, performed by people who believe they are simply doing their jobs. Fatima Ben Ali was one of them. Her story is not about espionage alone. It is about how easily ordinary obedience can be folded into extraordinary harm, and how the most decisive moments can pass unnoticed by the people who create them. That is the quiet legacy of April 14th, 1988. Years later, when analysts revisited the assassination, they often described it as inevitable. They spoke of intelligence superiority, of long reach, of an enemy marked long before his final night. In those retellings, the outcome felt predetermined, as though history itself had been moving toward that hotel room. What those narratives lacked was uncertainty. They left no space for hesitation, chance, or the fragile human links that made the operation possible. Because inevitability is comforting. It suggests events happen because they must, in reality, nothing about that morning was guaranteed. The door to room 412 could have remained closed. Fatima could have questioned the instruction. She could have walked away, reported the envelope, hesitated for only a moment longer. Any small deviation would have fractured the sequence. The operation relied not on force alone, but on compliance, so ordinary it barely registered as choice. This is the part history struggles to record. Operations are remembered by code names and outcomes, by maps and timelines. But the most decisive factor that morning was trust. Trust carefully cultivated over years. Trust reinforced by routine. Trust placed in a woman whose greatest asset was that no one ever noticed her. Fatima Ben Ali never intended to shape political history. She believed she was surviving, providing for her children, following instructions in a world where questioning authority rarely rewarded people like her. The people who recruited her understood this perfectly. They did not need loyalty. They needed predictability. And predictability is easier to engineer than belief. After her death, her life left little trace beyond family memories and employment records. No archive would connect her name to April 14, 1988. No document would list her contribution. In intelligence terms, she was a success precisely because she vanished back into normal life. Yet her absence from the record does not mean her role was small. The assassination altered trajectories. It reshaped leadership dynamics. It intensified conflict. It hardened positions on all sides. Those consequences rippled outward, touching lives far removed from that hotel corridor. Children grew up under different realities because of decisions made that morning. Strategies changed. Violence evolved. All of it passed through one unlocked door. The Hotel Africa still stands. Travelers pass through its lobby unaware of what unfolded there decades ago. Elevators rise and fall. Cleaning carts move quietly through hallways. New staff replace old ones. The routines continue because routine is how institutions survive history. Somewhere, another envelope was once placed in another locker. Somewhere else, another ordinary person was asked to perform an ordinary task with extraordinary implications. These stories rarely come to light, not because they are rare, but because they are affected. Fatima's story is unsettling precisely because it lacks drama. There was no chase, no confrontation, no moment where she understood everything and made a grand moral choice. There were only instructions, a key, and 7 minutes that felt longer than a lifetime. This is how modern power often works. Quietly, incrementally, through people who never see the full picture and are never meant to. When history asks how events happen, it often looks upward toward leaders and planners. But sometimes a more honest answer lies downward, in the unnoticed spaces where systems intersect with ordinary lives, the place where routine becomes leverage. Fatima Ben Ali did not see herself as important. That was the point, and that is the final truth of this story. Not that intelligence services are ruthless, or that conflicts are complex. Those things are already known. The truth is more uncomfortable, that history can hinge on people who believe they have no power at all. The question this story leaves behind is not about guilt or blame. It is simpler and harder. What instructions do we follow without questioning? What routines have we accepted because they feel harmless? And what doors might we open, believing nothing will pass through them? Because sometimes the door was never really locked.